Hello, welcome to the Emerging Future Institute. I'm Benjamin J. Butler, and today I'm joined by James Tempelhof. I think you're down in Rio de Janeiro, James.
We are in Rio de Janeiro, yes. So it is winter here, so probably not the best time of year to be in the south.
Right, of course. Well, James is the COO of BITNATION, and we're going to have a totally unscripted dialogue around the future of the nation state, and of course, then talk about BitNation, of course. Rather than me hash up an introduction, James, would you mind giving us a sort of minute introduction to your rather interesting background in the military?
Yeah, so I'm probably not your usual crypto enthusiast, or indeed, but although when I was young, I was an early adopter in the PC world and played around and actually did my master's thesis in, I was a geographer on building software to predict environmental change. But since that time, really, after a beginning in the military, I've spent most of my life working on preventing wars and trying to improve governance around the world, and rapidly coming to the conclusion that the problem was structural with governance itself and the nature of governance rather than in the ways it was applied. So I've worked as a senior executive and an operator for a major private security company, as a government advisor for the UK on preventing conflict and wars in places like Afghanistan, and also worked as the head of emergencies for a major charity responding to genocide in Rwanda and conflict in Somalia and things like that. So I came to crypto and to the idea of decentralized governance fairly late, but fairly enthusiastic, I should add.
Well, that's the important part. Things are changing so quickly. I watched this interview with Kevin Kelly, the futurist in California, the other day, and he said, the remarkable thing about this time is when we look back from the hindsight of 10 years, 20 years time, and we look back, actually in many of these areas in the fourth industrial revolution and the blockchain revolution, there's probably no expert alive today from that perspective. Which means it's kind of scary if you're sitting in a typical banking job or some old school job, and you're thinking, oh my God, everything's changing too quickly. Actually, if you just flip it and reverse it, you can very quickly get at the cutting edge of some of these trends and self-educate yourself in a very short period of time. And I'm hearing that everywhere. So it's just a mindset, I think.
I agree. I mean, I think like everything, you have to immerse yourself totally in a new subject to get up to speed. But for me, I mean, I've had, through my wife, Suzanne, who founded BitNation, I mean, I've had probably the best education that anyone could have in a short period of time, living and breathing decentralized technology and ideas for decentralizing governance now for whatever it is, nearly 2 years. And yeah, so I think, who's an expert? I mean, I used to worry when people started to call me an expert in my sort of late 40s, early 50s, which is a few years ago, but not that long ago. And I used to worry that it was kind of the end of the road. As soon as people thought you were an expert, it meant that really you'd run out of ideas. So I'm very pleased to be not an expert anymore and someone who learns new things every day.
And it's very important. I mean, part of my job is used to be in finance and is very much as a futurist as well, is talking to lots of experts in a way, and then often coming to the completely opposite conclusion. And it's it's because, and we're all guilty of this, as soon as we think we know a subject matter really well and we identify ourselves as an expert, we stop looking at fresh ideas, perspectives. Our brains become less malleable, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. I think there's a whole problem is that most areas of expertise, it's kind of, they make an assumption that certain areas are known. And yes, new ideas do come along, and there are people who push against them. I was one in the governance world that was pushing against some of the orthodoxy. But nevertheless, the expertise really becomes, it's a bit like a sort of a mimetic thing. There's a solution and everyone decides is the solution, and then you have technicians who are supposed to be able to apply the solution and they become the experts, rather than people who are challenging whether or not those solutions actually delivering anything useful. Being able then to think beyond the realms of this particular little area that's become, you know, a domain of expertise, and saying, well, maybe we need to ditch it and do something else. So I think it's, you know, sometimes expertise is problematic because it's really people who are very adept at delivering a solution. If it works, it's all good, all in good, but very often, certainly in our realm, in the realm of governance, it doesn't.
There's a very famous Zen teacher that passed away who lived in California, in San Francisco, who said, well, in the mind of the expert, there's only one possibility, but in the mind of the beginner, there are infinite possibilities.
Yes, we all need to be children again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was my favourite quote in Sophie's World. But before we get too philosophical, which would probably entertain you and I, but
probably nobody else. You're right.
May or may not entertain the listeners. I want to ask you. I want to pick your expertise or otherwise. Fascinating person to talk to, because you do have real life experience of the nation state, the good and the bad, and now you're at this cutting edge of, you know, what is the future of the nation state, and you actually have a solution as well. You're not just an academic. But before we talk about the solution, I was wondering what your thoughts are around the problems that we're stuck with the nation state.
So for me, I think the nation state, you know, first of all, the nation state is not the only option. It became the best of a bad job, if you like, the least worst option to govern ourselves for a period, because, you know, that was given that our technology, that was the best we had available. But what it is at its heart, because it's grounded in the idea of coercion. A monopoly over violence is a kind of definition of government. So its fundamental tool, if you like, is the use of coercion in order to govern. So we give our sovereignty, actually involuntarily, to the nation-state system because it says that we all have to do that. In so doing, it then uses that sovereignty to form a monopoly over violence, and with that monopoly over violence, it then uses that to coerce us into following rules. But that also has within it the seeds of destruction, because the nation state, because of having all that accumulated power and also only one real tool that it can use, and that is to coerce us through violence or threats of violence, is that it is the most profound and the most extraordinary killing machine ever invented. And I've seen that demonstrated. We all know, of course, historically, I mean, there are many examples, whether it's the Holocaust in World War II, or whether it's, just as I was reading the other day, whether it's the Cultural Revolution in China. We know the nation state, or if it finds that it can't achieve its aims through consensus, then it can enact the most extraordinary acts of violence to get its ends. I worked in Rwanda during the genocide. I actually witnessed a genocide take place and saw how this was not chaotic or any of the metaphors that were applied to Africa at the time of being disorganized and tribal conflict or whatever. I saw profoundly that government officers and officials at every level, down to the smallest village, were able to follow orders precisely and use, in this case, follow orders that involved getting people to kill their neighbors. Now, because of that, because it is such a profound killing machine, for me it is fatally flawed. It cannot deliver a utopian governance model. It is always going to, at one time or other, or use its violence against its citizens or against the citizens of other states in order to achieve what are often well-intentioned aims, to achieve peace and prosperity. It thinks ultimately that some people must die so others must live.
Some excellent points. I guess when you use the word monopoly of violence, it's very raw for you because of your experiences. For many people, take my father, who worked in the health service and now he's retired, and he plays a bit of golf, looks after the grandchildren and watches his exposure to the state, I guess, is he watches BBC News. So some people listening to this might, including people like my father, will hear the word monopoly of violence, and it will go in one ear and come out the other. Do you want to embellish on that?
Okay, so what a state says is not that it's wrong to harm other people, but that only the institutions of government are allowed to harm other people. And those institutions do that either through threats or, by saying that, if you don't follow this rule or regulation or whatever, you'll be forcibly arrested and thrown into a cage. Or alternatively, they do it through actual violence, by enacting violence either on their own citizens, by incarcerating them or whatever, or by taking their property, or alternatively by using violence against the citizens of other nation states, as we are doing, every day in the UK, for example. If this goes, I'm from the UK as you are, we are bombing every day. So in that sense, what I mean by the monopoly over violence is that we need a solution which makes violence only important if someone is trying to take away your sovereign right over your property, including yourself, your body, rather than it being something which can legitimately and routinely be used to force people to comply to a set of rules which may or may not act in your interest. And we know, many people who, people who live in more stable states in which they feel, well, maybe the state's, the best of a bad job because, there's order and so on and so forth, maybe more cynical or more complacent about giving their sovereignty to a state than in other places like the Rwandas or like, wherever, China or wherever you might be, where there is everyday oppression, or people can feel everyday oppression. But nevertheless, the system itself has that possibility. Unless we can change the system, then the possibility of giving your sovereignty to something which acts in your interests becomes less and less likely. And think about it, there are, just less than 200 nation states. Those nation states, those 200 bodies, have their institutions all of the sovereignty of 6 billion people. Now, does it make any sense that 200 groups of individuals who can probably 10, 20 individuals who sit around a table are the ones who make the everyday decisions in each of those jurisdictions. Does it make any sense that they could possibly make the right decisions for all of those 6 billion people? And when they don't make the right decisions, is it right that they should then have a monopoly over violence? They should then own all the instruments of violence to beat people, to follow those decisions, which may or may not be right and are not correct. And if you look at all of the nation states that exist in the world, there is a minority that one could say to some degree or other generally act in the interests of their people. And we've seen, and people say, well, what about democracy? Well, democracy, doesn't that mean that governments do what we want? Well, if you look at how you make decisions in your everyday life, you sit down with your family and your closest people you are dependent on or who are dependent on you, and you try and make the most pragmatic and rational decisions to improve your life. Well, if you use the democratic decision-making process that we have to do that, you, within your life, would be asking somebody you don't know and who doesn't know you to make those decisions, pragmatic decisions on your behalf. And if they didn't make those decisions on your behalf, then you would just have to lump it. So, it's a bit like the difference between going into an ice cream store and saying, there's 50 different ice creams and I'll try and make the decision based on how much money I've got and what I fancy and how many children I've got to give ice creams to on which ice cream I will buy. Or alternatively, going into the ice cream shop and then you have 2 ice creams to choose from, chocolate and vanilla. And then everybody in that ice cream shop has to agree on which ice cream you're going to be able to buy. And if you can't agree with everybody in there, then you end up with the one that you didn't want and doesn't serve you best. So what does that do? That forces us then to have conflict between each other to make a decision about, which would be easy for us as an individual because we've done a rationale. We know we want a chocolate ice cream, and 2 vanilla ice creams for our children, because we've had our little internal discussion and debate and reached a compromise with the people that we know and love, which is why we're making those decisions. Why should we then have to argue that case with a whole bunch of people we don't know in order that the shopkeeper can then provide us all with one choice? It's absurd. It's a crude instrument. It's an instrument that was put in place to give us more say, to try and reduce the power of those who have our sovereignty. But nevertheless, it's simply a crude compromise. It doesn't actually return our sovereignty to us. It means that we are just as victim to the tyranny of the majority as we would be to any other tyranny should the decision go against our best interests. And you and I come from the UK. I would not have wanted Brexit, but I have to lump it because the tyranny of the majority has told me that's that's the decision we're going to have. My life, I live in Europe as much as I live in the United Kingdom, more. I live in the world as more. It is not in my interest, but I'm having to lump it because the argument in the ice cream shop says that's the ice cream I have to have.
Yeah, excellent points. It was funny, in my previous incarnation, I studied law and constitution, and I started spending more time in the States, and I just remember this time where I met a bunch of Americans. It doesn't actually matter where, and they were all talking about owning various firearms. And I was quite surprised by, what kind of firearms, like pretty serious machine guns and things. And literally everyone at the table, they were all wealthy people. And I turned around to the lady next to me and I said, so you all live in quite nice neighborhoods and stuff. Why do you own them? And the answer astonished me. Because they said it's to protect us from government.
Ha!
not from, you know, marauding criminals that were going to steal they were wealthy people.
Yes.
And it was the first time I kind of thought, oh, right. Because in the UK, we don't have, obviously, the Second Amendment. We don't have guns and stuff like that. And it threw up a lot of issues for me. And then, of course,
we didn't have the American Revolution. And of course, you know, if instead of the American dream, you might talk about the American meme. And the American meme is about defending oneself from a government which wanted to do things that those colonists didn't want. So in a sense, history tells Americans that you need to protect yourself against tyranny, you know, and it's long history. I mean, Tom Paine was a dissident in the UK, you know, before he went to France and then to the United States and helped, you know, build that meme, if you like. So in a sense, it's also a long tradition of British philosophical thinking, you know, whether it's Locke or, and particularly from the 17th century, from the period of the Civil War, which I think has led to that American position. But the problem with that is that it's not really evolved. You know, there's often people now see it as a fixed universal, in the sense that the US Constitution has become a fixed universal, rather than applying it in a kind of reasonable way to the state the world is now.
Yeah, it's. I think there's some great things in the American Constitution, and sadly, people are kind of forgetting the good parts. But clearly, it's not the only solution.
But the reason, I think, you know, I'll tell you a story. Why not tell you a story? I was in Liberia at the time of the Hurricane Katrina event in New Orleans. And what happened in New Orleans is, you know, if anyone doesn't remember the event, there was a huge flood, and the banks of the river, the Mississippi, broke and flooded a large part of the city. And then there was a huge amount of violence and looting and kind of things that people associate with, you know, other parts of the world, maybe like, you know, Africa or wherever. I was in Liberia. Liberia didn't have a government at the time. It hadn't had a government for a long time. It had quite a few people competing to try and be government. But because they were competing and because they hadn't had government for a while, in essence, people had gone to looking, you know, most people had their sovereignty returned in one way or the other. And I was with a group of US State Department officials, and I was taking them to a plantation where one group of these rebels were hanging out, and we were trying to persuade them to come out and rejoin society. But on the way out, I said, oh, let's stop and get some, you know, some fruit and something to drink. And we stopped in the main market in Monrovia, which is the capital city. And the main market was functioning perfectly. There were lots of ladies there, you know, selling fruit and vegetables and cloth and da-da-da. It had no more government infrastructure and policing than New Orleans had in the middle of the events that were taking place immediately after Katrina at exactly the same time. And yet it was perfectly functional. And it was functional because people didn't have an expectation that they had to rely on government for order. So they hadn't, so there's two sides to the sovereignty debate, really, because not only have we given our sovereignty to states, but because we've given it to states, we've kind of lost some of our need or requirement to be responsible and to cooperate effectively with our other citizens. We expect the state to do it on our behalf. It's kind of infantile, or whatever the word is. It's turned us back into children, in a sense that we're dependent upon the state to do things. And if the state isn't there, we just think we can run around like, you know, and behave like naughty children, rather than understanding that we have a responsibility to our fellow humans. and that responsibility to them, which exists in many of the societies that I've worked in, whether it's in Africa or Asia or here in Latin America, has kind of been taken away from us. We just say, well, the state will provide, or the state will do this. In that sense, I think we actually could build a more cooperative society, not a less cooperative society. Instead of pooling our resources and giving our resources to these distant and often ill-informed bodies to act on our behalves in ways that they may or may not do in our interests, and also, frankly, sometimes I've worked for government. Often they do in a very, in a way which is very wasteful and inefficient, because they haven't got the right solutions, or they're making guesses, rough guesses about what the solutions should be. So in the absence of, if we return our sovereignty to ourselves, we're likely to be more cooperative, and we're likely to work better with people, and the potential for violence between people, I think, would be dramatically reduced. We don't have to fight with each other over who is going to govern us. And you look, I mean, I don't know, you probably, like me, you probably have a lot of people from the United States on your Facebook, and I look every day at people arguing left and right, and hugely divisive discussions, which are not about what can I do, they're about what can some remote thing do, and which remote thing should be doing it. I mean, in my view, wholly wasteful, pointless sets of conflicts that have been constructed between us because of this way we've structured the way we govern ourselves.
Yeah, I totally concur. And what I've increasingly become convinced by and passionate about is decentralization, because I think I took a year out and studied aspects of ecology at Schumacher College, and because I thought I'd get many insights from the animal and plant kingdom, the idea of self-organizing systems, and to learn some of the sciences, quantum physics and chaos theory, etc. And I found actually in finance, I had more insights from nature and my walks in nature and observing nature than I did the financial textbooks. But for everything, you look at how efficient nature is, and it's all self-organizing systems. And so I think one of the big themes for this century is biomimicry. I think actually Steve Jobs said it towards the end of his life, that some of the big revolutions will come from the convergence of, I think he said, technology and biology. But I think we've got so much to learn.
I agree with you.
For me, the events of 2016, one of the lessons, there seems to be sort of a dynamic playing out, maybe a war playing out between decentralization and centralization at the moment, and some people are cognizant and aware of it, and some are not. But it's going on underneath everything, and I guess you've come from a certain background and experienced centralization, and you see the dangers of it, and now you're moving in the other direction.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, the way we live our lives, we are. I mean, this is a bit of a cliche, but we are more global, and we all simultaneously have become more local, and that's because the technology that enables us to communicate and make agreements amongst ourselves has enabled us to live our lives in a different way. If you think about the nation state, when it was created in Europe, in the, I guess one could say Louis XIV invented the first effective nation state. Basically, it was limited by how far you could travel in one day, and that was if you were wealthy on a horse, and if you weren't, on your feet. And how could you communicate? Well, you had to walk, go see your neighbor, go walk to the market, or ride a horse to the market. The world was defined by these limits, these communication limits, that you physically had to go to places to communicate with people, and the ability to do that was fairly limited. So we built a world around a technology which no longer, or governance system around a set of technologies which are no longer relevant to our lives. Now we can communicate to anyone globally easily, and we do, most of us, every day, one way or the other, whether it's watching a movie from Hollywood or whether it's talking to somebody on Facebook from another continent or whatever it might be. So I think, and also in terms of locally, so our day-to-day dependencies are super global, and they're also very local, because the people that we know and love around us are in a local area, and we want to be more connected in those local areas. So the nation state, I mean, I wrote in something that we did for BitNation, you know, it's a bit like a kind of beached whale. It's like stranded between these two tide lines. On the one hand, we're interested in our local area and our community and our family, and improving and making that a better place to live for ourselves and the people that we love. And on the other hand, we're interested in communicating over much longer distances for our work and for our entertainment and so on and so forth. So where does the nation state fit in this? Well, the nation state has kind of recognized it, or tried to recognize it, through building bilateral and multilateral agreements and the sort of United Nations model that came out of World War II and so on. But, you know, all that does is further centralize power and makes it less accountable, and the democratic processes that we tried to put in place as checks and balances on centralized power, they are not really scalable to that level. And the evidence is like things like the European Union. It's impossible to have like a European government that anybody takes seriously. So they end up, you shift back towards tyranny, with the power in the hands of unelected officials, whether they're UN officials or EU officials or whoever it might be. And so is being and has, you know, more and more rejected. So as the system begins to kind of not be capable, more and more apparent that it's less and less relevant to the way we live our lives, it starts to fracture, and we start to take it less seriously. And so things like Brexit and Trump and some of these outlier kind of possibilities actually, you know, take over the state, because it's becoming less relevant to people's lives, and in a sense it's having less leverage on our lives, because, you know, it can do less. So those institutions for me are already beginning to die, and then it's a natural death because we're not using them, or we're beginning not to use them. And then you take, you know, Satoshi and you know, Bitcoin. Well, maybe if you want to look at some historical events, you look at the, you know, from 1989, the fall of 2001 and 9/11, and then to the financial crisis in 2008. And those three events between them have led us to a point where a powerful desire to develop decentralized technology resulted in Satoshi producing Bitcoin, and Bitcoin was the first kind of discovery. It wasn't a discovery, creation of this new world that we could live in, saying, actually, we have now the technology to live in the way that we are already living in terms of communications and so on. So I think we're seeing, on the one hand, the death of the old system, and a painful death. And most people feel locked into that decline and fall, if you like. And on the other hand, a few enlightened individuals, I've become one myself, seeing that actually this is not a civilization collapsing, it's the birth of a new one. And for me, the best historical analogy, I know people talk about a new industrial revolution, but for me it's a new renaissance. It's the equivalent of discovering a new world, in the way that Europeans were able to travel to the Americas and to Asia in ways that they'd not been able to, or a few did, but had not been able to in the past because of technology that made navigation possible and made the world of nation states possible, actually, ultimately. Situation where new knowledge has been created, new knowledge has opened up a whole new world. And if gradually, I think, we will see the population, mankind as a whole, move into that new world and occupy that new world and create a better, less violent way of governing.
Sorry, I was muted for a second. Yeah, I love the analogy. I started writing a couple of years ago about the comments. I do a lot of travel, and I'd come out of meetings with people very involved in the old world, and particularly finance, and they were all depressed and saying things were getting worse. And then I'd come out of meetings with scientists, technologists, and people in the sort of more spiritual realm, the sort of self-education, leadership, these kind of fields. And all of these people were very often over the moon about the changes that were happening in the world. And so I started to think, we're at a strange time where things seem to be getting better at a quicker pace and getting worse at a quicker pace at the same time. And that comment sort of made no sense. But if you look at complexity theory and things like that, it makes total sense. We're literally at the edge of chaos, and where everything becomes possible. A friend of mine who's an advisor to our institute, Simon Robinson, wrote a book called Holonomics. There's a page there where he talks about interviewing his students on a complexity course that he teaches. And I think he asked them to write down their reactions to the word chaos and complexity, and they were all negative adjectives. And then when they learned about chaos and complexity and disorder, they realized, hang on, it's not such a bad thing. We've got this kind of, I guess we like order and all the rest of it. But if you look at the underlying science, we're going into a great time, I think.
I agree with you. I mean, I think your point that you made earlier about, using biological analogies or looking at the way that biology has built, this most beautiful, wonderful thing we call life on this planet, and how it's done that without any central control, simply through individual organisms interacting with each other in fairly rational ways, then I think that is the way that we are meant to be. So in a sense, we've created we've put brakes on our evolution, on our development, by creating a set of structures which don't really reflect our fundamental nature, if you like. I mean, kind of Locke talked about that we are born in a state of nature, that we're born with our sovereignty and without having to give that sovereignty to anyone. And I've also read some of the literature as well. And I remember years ago, before I knew anything about blockchains and decentralized tech, reading Johnson's book about emergence. And he compared two cities which grew without any central planning. One of them was Manchester in the UK, and the other was Los Angeles in the US. And if you do an analysis of those cities, they're divided they've broken naturally into a sort of network of clusters where where you can find services, where there are shops and banks and whatever services you need. And in Manchester, because Manchester grew earlier than Los Angeles, they're kind of walking distance apart, comfortable walking distance. And in Los Angeles, which grew in the age of the car, they're in comfortable driving distance. But they're all beautifully self-designed to make it possible for everybody to get the services they need within the within the context of the technology that was available to people at that time. So in a sense, what decentralized technology is doing that at a global scale. If we let it go, if we trust ourselves in the way we interact with individuals who we know and like, then if we trust, a world will emerge, and that world that will emerge will be most effectively in our individual interests. But we have to trust ourselves to do it. And in particular, the institutions we've set up to allow us, which fundamentally believe that we are untrustworthy, then those institutions will have to break and die. But and the only way for that to happen is there's no point attacking those institutions. I mean, they kill all of us instantly. We know that. We built them in that way. Much better is that people just stop using them. And through the process of not using them so much in their everyday lives and relying on these emergent technologies more, then those institutions themselves, which are populated by people, obviously, just individuals like the rest of us, they will decline in importance, and they will become less pervasive in our lives, because all the people who occupy them and believe in them will start to believe in allowing emergent systems allowing ourselves to govern ourselves through emergent systems, because they will make our lives better.
Sorry, I have to keep pressing the mute and unmute button.
Give me an opportunity to have a cigarette break whilst you're
exactly. That we discussed it, I think, yesterday, and it's coming up in all my conversations in the last week. The phrase that Buckminster Fuller came up with about building the new in parallel to the old.
Don't bother trying to change the old. It's a soul destroyer. I mean, I tried for many years inside the international system, particularly focused on trying to prevent conflict, and both within government and within the charitable sector, which is essentially a subcontractor of government, or has become so. And it is impossible. I had a really strong realization when in Afghanistan, understanding that no one actually knew what they were doing and why they were there, really at the highest levels in the UK. No one really had a clear idea of what they were doing. And the only thing they could do, and this is the same with charities as well, the only thing they could do is think of replicating themselves, their own institution, in the place where they were, having a kind of arrogant hubris that somehow what they had and the way they were structured was somehow better than what was there. And so what we do is have these systems of government that go around trying to replicate themselves in places where it's totally inappropriate, because, as we know, every system of government did emerge somehow from within a polity of its own. It is not, they weren't designed for global. They grew through violence and conflict of all of their own within a particular place. So the idea that you can just replicate something that clearly doesn't work very well anyway, everywhere else, has proven to be a disaster. I mean, it's why we have perpetual war. There are Islamists trying to replicate, Islamic governance models everywhere. There are Westerners trying to replicate democratic models everywhere, and whatever. Communists trying to replicate communism. I mean, it's just a disaster. We need to to bring all that to an end and allow our good nature to build the world that we really belong to.
Yeah, I like the way you keep emphasizing our good nature, because I have a lot of well-meaning friends who they get to a ballot box and they're still sort of sucked into the old system and feel compelled. Well, if I'm a well-meaning guy and I'm compassionate, then I've got to vote Democrat in the States, for example, which means they're voting for bigger and bigger government. And so the idea of smaller government is kind of an abhorrence. They think society could break down, and it would be anarchy, and no one will get looked after, and And
really hoping it will be anarchy.
What's that?
I'm really hoping it will be anarchy.
Well, that's the thing, you know. Anarchy is another one of those words that
you can't really use it because it's been like chaos and so on. You know, governments they're fundamental. I mean, you know, if you read any sort of political philosophy, they will use the government to create order. And if you argue, you know, most people who've looked at the history of government say, well, you know, it was there because people had no other choice but to give sovereignty to some powerful individual or group of individuals in order to stop people whacking them over the head and stealing their, you know, their property. And one could say, well, yeah, that probably emerged during urbanization when people had to live much more closely together than they had in the past, and there was a need for some sort of order. But order, as we know, if order then translates itself into that very small group of individuals making all the decisions on behalf of everyone, then what happens is the system, that our ability to evolve these emergent and very super efficient and super good for us systems fails. And we end up with, you know, these disasters of central planning, whether it's, you know, whatever it might be, whether they're wars or whether it's the Cultural Revolution or whatever it might be, which kill people and kill lots of people and make very few people happy, if any, apart from maybe the ones who think that it was a good idea in the first place. So I think, you know, from that perspective, we have to, in order for us to deal with global challenges, you know, all the things, all the horror stories that we're told about global warming, so on and so forth, we absolutely have to have less government, but not less governance. We need more governance. And that governance needs to come from us working with our friends and our neighbors and our families, and having the power returned to us to do that in the best way possible.
Well said. I think we've had a really good dialogue about the failure of the nation state, and what I'd like to propose actually is we stop here, and I invite you back for part 2, so we can sort of discuss the solutions, and then we can have a more in-depth discussion about BITNation, because you're, as I said at the beginning, you're not just a well-read academic. You're actually providing a really important solution, and I don't want to just dedicate the last 5 minutes to BITNation. I think it's a really important movement that you're working on, and I'd like to discuss that a bit more thoroughly.
That would be great. That would be great. And, you know, I'm not an academic. I'm an operator. I've been an operator my whole life. So in that sense, you know, my forte is always kind of making things happen. So it'll be exciting and interesting to talk about, you know, how we can make things happen, but not in the kind of blind utopian madness that we can somehow control everything that everybody does and build a perfect world that way.
No. You know, your ice cream analogy is very good. And I remember, I don't know if you read any of David Corton's books. He wrote a book called The Great Turn-In from Empire to Earth Community. And there's a great chapter in it where he's got data on these key statements, questions that were given to many Americans. And between 60 and 80% of the people agreed on all these statements. And it goes on for pages and pages and pages. And then you compare it to the results of the nation state and you think, what the hell? You know, Americans agree on these number of profound things, whether it's family values, all sorts. I need to ask his permission to copy and paste it and put it on our website. But it was a real eye opener to me, and I love the conclusion of his book. You know, he's talking about empire to earth community, which to me, you know, again going back to that point which I like to labour, that smaller government doesn't necessarily mean less compassion, because we need to go back and build community. Whether it's,
and we are forced now to compete with for the governance, services, and dynamics that we wish. So we are made to be, we are put into conflict. We are asked by the nation-state system to fight for the governance that we want. That should be the other way around. The governance service providers, they should be competing with one another for citizens, for us to want their services. So having created a situation which is essentially divisive, as you said, most people agree fundamentally, probably on most things. And yet it's the areas that we disagree that become central to any discussion on governance, not the myriad areas where we already agree. So we are forced into conflict, and conflict obviously is often manifested as violence. So why should we live in a system which makes us fight with one another, whether it's metaphorically or physically, in order to get the governance services that we desire? Which shouldn't it be the other way around? The service providers should be competing with one another to get our custom. And that's the kind of world that we would wish, that removes as much as possible the grounds for conflict between individuals.
Absolutely. And going back to going back to nature, I think Charles Darwin's work is very misunderstood. People talk about competition, and I think someone went through the book and counted that the word collaboration and cooperation, coordination, these kind of words appear in the book more than competition. But
yes,
of course, it's been.
And that's the point I was trying to make. If governance services are provided at a more granular level, and that we have millions of options to choose from, we can create options around smaller groups of, serving smaller groups of people than these few monolithic institutions that we have now, then there will be there's much more grounds for cooperation than there ever is for competition. So, and as I said, the reason why I drew that parallel between Liberia and New Orleans during the Katrina period is that actually people, given the incentive to cooperate, given the option to cooperate, and with the fear of government taken away from them, and also without that sort of mimetic understanding that without government they are powerless and they are, going to be in trouble. All the support structures are gone. If they understand that they have all those support structures within and around them in their community, as soon as that happens, I think people will become much more cooperative, and they'll find much fewer grounds for conflict.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've got lots of my own data points from hearing stories about post-tsunami Japan and how everyone coordinated and cooperated with no central authority. The earthquake actually in Kobe, I heard stuff about that.
I lived in Sarajevo during the war in Bosnia. It was extraordinary how nice people were, how people became so much nicer to one another when they had a real and genuine need to cooperate.
Yeah, some kind of higher purpose. And one friend of mine, he was working with some top people in Silicon Valley as a chip engineer. I think he worked with Steve Jobs and some other top people. And he retired and he moved to Thailand, northern Thailand. And his expectation was that the nation state would start to break down. And when the world went into this period of disorder, he wanted to be in a society that had a certain resilience to that. And I guess it goes back to Nassim Taleb's great book, Anti-Fragility, that he thought northern Thailand was used to, changes and shifts, and in that people were still quite compassionate. generally, and you know, he made an intelligent decision based on resilience that he was going to move into that kind of society.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, if there was some kind of cataclysm, I realize that that's also a kind of absurd thing. But, you know, I certainly would prefer to be in East Africa or Southeast Asia than in Western Europe or in North America, who I think are wholly unprepared to live cooperative lives. But, you know, I think on the other hand, therefore, it makes sense that those technologies are emerging in those societies because, in a sense, they're much more needed there. And we also, you know, hopefully that will save them from falling in upon themselves.
Mm. Well, I really enjoyed the conversation, James, and I've got a great excuse to invite you back for part 2 because we need to talk about BITNATION and the exciting developments there. But really appreciate it, and we will talk again soon.
Great, thank you very much. That was really nice to talk to you, Benjamin. And let's do this again soon.
Great, thank you, James.